Good evening, and thank you so much for inviting me to have just a little bit of time with you to focus on what's happening in North Carolina. I have been so moved and inspired by the speakers who came before me, and I feel like they've said it all, and so I'm not sure what I can add except to tell you some specifics about North Carolina and what's been happening here. And what I want to share is that I was a civil rights attorney for 30 years before running for the court, and litigated voting rights cases in Virginia as well as many other states in the South. And I saw from that work that traditionally there's always been a two-pronged assault and I think initially or originally or through most of my work, it was assault on the rights of African Americans and Latino voters to cast a ballot. But there's always been vote suppression combined with some kind of gerrymandering. So you both keep people from voting and you rig the system, rig the structures of the democracy so that even if they do vote, their votes won't count fairly. And sadly, and to some degree, I think this kind of bears true. If any of you remember the name Lonnie Guinier, another a really brilliant voting rights attorney whose footsteps I followed in, she talked about how Black voters are the canary in the coal mine. They were these, in essence, these vote suppression tactics were tried on Black voters, but people should have had an inkling that they were going to use them more broadly. So Black voters are kind of the warning sign that if things are foul in the environment, it's going to hurt everyone. And that is exactly what we've seen in North Carolina. I say that because we are ground zero for testing out some pretty outrageous vote suppression tactics. So I just came from an event honoring my colleague, Justice Allison Riggs, and some of you may have heard of what happened in 2024 in her election, where the first step to vote suppression was to require voters to cast provisional ballots, and then there needed, right in the 9 days after the election, there needed to be a ballot curing process. So these are people who got up in the morning, went to the polls, wanted to exercise their right to vote, knew who they wanted to vote for, but because they didn't either have proper ID or there's some issue with their registration, they had to cast a provisional ballot, but it could be cured if they could prove that they weren't fraudulent, kind of a you're guilty until you prove you're innocent approach. But if they could prove that they were legitimate voters, then they could vote. Their votes would count. And it was the work of groups across the state, including many nonpartisan nonprofit C3 and C4 groups that did the hard, incredible work of reaching out to voters to get them to cure their ballots, that ultimately they cured more ballots than the margin of victory for Justice Riggs. So she won by, ultimately, when all the votes that were going to be counted, and there were plenty that I would suggest were illegitimately thrown out, but when the ballots were counted, she won by 734 votes out of 5.5 million votes cast. So, if you do talk to folks who think their vote doesn't matter, there are plenty of really close elections, even in very large jurisdictions and large electorates. But that was only stage one. Stage two was litigation from her opponent trying to throw out ballots. He wanted to throw out the ballots of over 80,000 voters because their last four of their Social Security or their driver's license number wasn't on their registration. He also wanted to throw out the ballots of military and overseas voters. And I guess what you need to understand is I serve with 4 Republicans. We have a 7-member state Supreme Court. We are all elected in partisan elections for 8-year terms. And I serve with 4 Republicans who ruled that those military and overseas ballots should not be counted, even though those voters complied with every rule that they were given at the time they voted. And it was only because a federal court stepped in and said, there are very serious equal protection and due process problems with changing the rules of the election after the election in order to get the outcome you want. So the federal court said you can't do that, and Justice Riggs was sworn in to take her seat. But the court also said you can do all that before the next election. So that means right now in North Carolina, we face a really important battle going on right as we speak to make sure that the registrations of voters who don't have the last four of their social, that they get, the state board of elections is calling it cured or repaired, registration repair. But a lot of people don't realize because the registration repair list is different from the Griffin list that was challenged in the election. And we also know that in our municipal elections and in 2026 and going forward, those military and overseas voters will have to show an ID, which is something that if you're military and overseas in any other state in the country, you don't have to do that. But in North Carolina, you will. So there's a huge public education effort that we need. And we just know that we need to be registering voters now in this, so that people's voices will be heard. But let me also talk to you about gerrymandering, because again, I feel like North Carolina was ground zero. The case in which the U.S. Supreme Court decided that they would not touch partisan gerrymandering came from North Carolina, Rucho versus Common Cause. And the US Supreme Court said, well, we're not going to address it, but state Supreme Courts can. And ultimately, as new districts were drawn following the 2020 census, litigants brought to our court a challenge to our state congressional districts and our state House and state Senate districts. And a trial court, hearing the evidence, found that they were extreme partisan gerrymanders. The 2022 Supreme Court said that violates your rights under the state constitution. And we required the legislature to redraw. North Carolina sent 7 Democrats and 7 Republicans to Congress after that redraw when fair maps were in place. But then we had an election and our court changed hands. It had previously been 4 Democrats, 3 Republicans. And understand, the court opinion said, doesn't matter who does it. These are the tests for gerrymandering. And under our state constitution, extreme partisan gerrymandering is unconstitutional. The new court took power and reheard that case, which is just extraordinary. It's not happened before in the history of our court. It sort of violates all sorts of legal principles, not only stare decisis, but also law of the case. Once you decide what the law is in a particular case, you're supposed to continue to apply that law in that case. But our court reheard and said, they didn't say they aren't gerrymanders. They said, well, you know, we just, it's not for us to say. It's up to the legislature. We as a court have no power to constrain the legislature. So the legislature redrew, and in the next election, we sent 10 Republicans and 4 Democrats to Congress. And if we had kept the 7-7 delegation, right now today, the U.S. House of Representatives would be in the control of Democrats. So that is the impact that state Supreme Court races have had, not only on, and I could talk about what happened in the state legislature, but it obviously impacts the entire country. And while other states have referenda and can have citizens initiatives, we do not have that in North Carolina. So the only path to a democracy in this state that fairly reflects the voting strength and voting patterns of the voters of this state is through the courts, is to come back to, is to again have a state Supreme Court that is committed to the principle that extreme partisan gerrymandering violates the state constitution. And so fortunately, Justice Riggs, herself also a voting rights attorney, is on our court. I am running for re-election in 2026. And in 2028, 3 Republican seats on our court are up, and we can flip the court if Democrats are successful in carrying those seats. And that would be before the next round of redistricting. But I think what I want to leave you with there's, as a judicial candidate, there's a lot I can't say, and I can't, but I can give you status of cases and I can give you updates on what's happening here. And as a political candidate, what I can tell you is that I know, I run statewide, so I have to reach those millions of voters across the state. And in order to do that, from my perspective, there are sort of three legs to the stool that I need. One is I have to have a strong campaign myself. And that's all the things that go into having a strong campaign. I need the state party because we run as partisan. And it's interesting, I don't think we'll have a repeat in North Carolina of the $100 million that was spent in Wisconsin. But I do know that we will have spending in this race more than we've ever seen before in North Carolina. So I need a strong Democratic Party, and I need the third rung, vitally important, is the C3 and C4 tables that do that nonpartisan voter registration, voter protection work. People trust people that they know. Right. And it's one thing for me to go to a community and talk about my background and why our courts matter. But when there are people in community, the people they trust, who are giving them that message and urging them to vote and have their voice heard, it makes a huge difference. And there are so many important constituencies in this state whose voices have not been heard. I told you about those 80,000 voters that currently need to repair their registration list. Well, you should know that roughly 70% of those 80,000 are registered Democrats. And if you're an African American voter in North Carolina, you are 3 times more likely to be on that list. I know that students, in particular, people who registered when they were in college on their college campuses, are another universe that is more likely to be disenfranchised by this current situation. So we know that we have a huge battle ahead, but I also understand and believe that working together we can protect our democracy, and it is groups like Center for Common Ground and the other groups that you partner with and the work that you do in the states that ultimately is what will save us as a country. So I'm grateful to you for your work, and thank you so much for giving me this chance to give you an update on North Carolina.